The sky above Outpost Vega-9 split open like torn metal, and the alarms wailed through every hallway as if the whole station were screaming for help. Lieutenant Aaron Hawley ran through the shaking corridors while red emergency lights flashed against the walls and sparks rained from broken wires above him. The Vulcan swarm had found them at last, and every echoing impact on the outer hull meant another giant enemy ship ramming closer, another boarding claw digging its way in. Aaron listened to the panicked voices on the comms as he ran, hearing the fear hiding behind the orders of officers who were trained not to fear anything. Commander Lewis shouted at him to fall back to Dock C, to evacuate, to leave everything and escape before the swarm tore the outpost apart. Aaron tried to obey until he rounded a corner and stopped so suddenly he almost fell. A cracked containment cage stood against the wall, its doors hanging open like broken jaws. Strange blue sparks danced around the metal edges, giving off a faint humming sound. Inside the cage, chained by glowing restraints, was a girl small, thin, with dark hair and glowing silver eyes that locked onto his the moment he looked at her. She wasn't human. Her skin shimmered with soft blue markings that pulsed like veins of light beneath her surface. The scientists on the station had called her a Kiran, one of the rare psychic species almost no one had ever met in person. They had labeled her feral because she didn't speak and reacted to everything with fear or aggression, like a wild creature trapped in a world far from home. Aaron had never seen her up close, but he had heard rumors, whispers, and arguments about her. Some said she was dangerous. Others said she was a child. Now her cage was broken, and she was staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. Another explosion rocked the hallway, and a shower of sparks lit up her face. She flinched and pressed herself into the back of the cage as if trying to disappear. Aaron looked at the broken chains, at the damage to the outpost, at the shaking walls, at the enemy breaching from every direction. If the Vulcan captured her, they would use her powers as a weapon. The war could end right here and not in humanity's favor. Aaron swallowed hard, fighting the urge to run, fighting the pounding in his chest. He took one small step toward the alien girl. "I'm getting you out of here," he said, even though he wasn't sure she understood a word. She blinked once, then slowly reached for the chain on her wrist as if asking him to remove it. Aaron reached into the cage carefully, afraid she might scratch or look away, but she didn't resist. Her hand trembled as he freed her. The moment the restraint fell away, the humming energy around her faded. She stood still, watching him with the wary gaze of someone who had never been offered kindness. He held out his hand, not sure what else to do. After a long pause, she stepped forward and placed her hand gently in his, her fingers cold and delicate. The breath caught in his throat. She trusted him, even for a second. But the moment shattered as the wall behind them exploded inward and the Vulcan warriors burst through with a roar, towering monsters in burning red armor. Aaron grabbed the alien girl and pulled her toward the emergency pod nearby, diving inside just as the hatch sealed and the pod shot away into the darkness. The last thing he saw through the small window was the outpost collapsing behind them in fire and smoke. He didn't know where the pod would land or if help would ever come. All he knew was that he wasn't alone anymore, and the fate of two worlds now rested in his hands. The escape pod drifted through cold space for hours before it finally collided with an old, abandoned research cruiser that floated above a red desert planet like a ghost ship waiting for someone to remember it. Aaron forced the emergency hatch open and pulled the alien girl inside the silent halls, feeling as if they were stepping into a giant tomb. Dust covered the floors, the lights were dead, and every corner felt frozen in time. His wrist scanner told him the truth he didn't want to hear. Rescue ships were 4 days away at best, if the Terran fleet even knew where he was, and the Vulcan patrols could find them at any moment. The girl, still holding his hand at first, finally let go and stepped back as he checked the rooms. her silver eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She moved with a strange mix of fear and curiosity, like someone who had never been free to explore anything. Aaron tried to talk to her, but she only watched him with those bright, quiet eyes, saying nothing. When he approached too fast, she flinched like a wounded animal, so he slowed down and kept his voice gentle. He found a storage room with old ration packs and laid one near her, stepping away so she wouldn't feel cornered. She didn't touch it while he watched, but later, when he came back, the food was gone. The next day he tried again, placing food closer to where he sat on the floor. She waited until he wasn't looking directly at her, then crept forward, grabbed the pack, and retreated to a safe distance to eat. He pretended not to notice, letting her think she kept her guard, even though he smiled at how she peeked at him between bites. By the third day, she no longer ran to the far corner when he entered the room. Instead, she sat 2 meters away, knees pulled to her chest, her glowing markings dim and soft. Sometimes she tilted her head as if listening to some sound only she could hear. When he spoke to her in a calm voice, she didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, and she started relaxing little by little. On the 4th day, she sat even closer, only about a meter from him, watching him fix broken equipment with focused eyes that followed every movement of his hands. Aaron could see something changing in her expressionless fear, more trust, and a quiet, shy curiosity. But the fragile calm didn't last. While he was searching for parts to repair the cruiser's power system, a deep rumble shook the floor beneath him, followed by another, louder one. He ran to the control room and jumped onto the old chair, wiping dust off the screen. His heart sank. The Virkin had tracked the escape pod and were closing in fast. Their ships glowed like angry red stars on the scanner. He turned sharply as the alien girl appeared behind him, silent as always, watching the warning lights with wide eyes. "They're coming," he said, unsure why he spoke out loud when she didn't know his language. She stepped closer, her eyes glowing brighter, not in fear but in some strange readiness. Then, for the first time, she reached out and touched his arm lightly, carefully, like she wanted him to know she understood the danger too. There was no voice, no word, no sound, only the simple warmth of her touch. Aaron felt a spark of connection he couldn't explain, and in that moment he knew he wasn't just protecting her anymore. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not, and the enemy was already at their door. The Virkin boarding claws hit the derelict cruiser like metal spears, cutting through the hull with a deafening screech that echoed through every empty hallway, and Aaron knew they had only minutes before the warriors stormed inside. He grabbed the plasma rifle he had taken from the outpost and turned to the alien girl, who stood behind him with her silver eyes glowing brighter than ever. She no longer looked frightened. She looked alert, focused, as if a hidden strength inside her had finally awakened. Aaron pointed toward a safer corner and told her to stay behind him, even though he doubted she understood his words. But instead of moving back, she stepped forward with a strange calmness in her movements. She touched her chest and whispered a soft sound, "Era," clearly telling him her name. The moment surprised him, and he almost forgot the danger outside. He repeated her name gently, then pointed to himself and said, "Aaron," hoping she would understand. She nodded once, and something small but important passed between them like a silent promise. But the wall shook again, and the metal in the floor vibrated under their feet. The Virkin were inside the ship. Aaron raised his rifle and took a steadying breath, ready to fight, when Era suddenly moved ahead of him and lifted her hand. The air around her shimmered, bending and twisting as if gravity itself was shaking. Aaron stared, stunned, as a wave of bright energy burst from her palm and shot down the hallway. The Virkin warriors who had just entered, huge armored beasts with burning red helmets, were thrown backward like toys, crashing into walls hard enough to dent the metal. The light faded slowly, leaving a smell like hot electricity behind. Aaron had known Karen were psychic, but he had never imagined power like this. When he turned to Era, expecting her to look proud or angry, he saw her swaying on her feet, her glowing markings flickering weakly as if her energy had drained in seconds. She would have fallen if Aaron hadn't rushed forward and caught her. She looked up at him with tired eyes, breathing hard, and he whispered, "Easy. Don't push yourself like that." He helped her stand and heard another alarm beeping on the ship's control panel. He glanced at the screen and felt his stomach twist. A large Vulcan destroyer had locked onto the cruiser, and its massive guns were charging. Not dozens of warriors, hundreds. Not small weapon ship killers. Aaron looked at Era, who was trying to steady herself, and for the first time he felt something like fear for her instead of fear of her. Before he could speak, she placed her hand gently on his forehead, and a surge of warmth flowed into his mind. For a moment he couldn't breathe. He saw images, feelings, emotions, panic, loneliness, cold darkness, memories of cages and pain, and then something gentle and bright, something fragile but strong. Her thoughts reached his in simple, wordless shapes. She protected. He protected. Together. He didn't understand how it worked, but he understood her meaning. He nodded slowly and took her hand. "Together," he whispered. A new strength filled him, not from her power but from her trust. The sound of metal claws scraping closer broke the moment. The enemies were regrouping. Aaron stood beside Era, raising his rifle as she lifted her glowing hand again. They faced the burning hallway together, human and Chiron, both breathing fast, both exhausted, but both refusing to back down. The next wave of the Vulcan poured in like a flood of red armor and claws. And the battle began all over again. The derelict cruiser shook like a wounded beast as the battle raged through its empty halls, the sound of explosions rolling through the metal corridors while sparks lit up the shadows. Aaron moved fast, firing his plasma rifle with sharp, controlled bursts as Vulcan warriors charged through the smoke, their heavy armor glowing red under the flashing lights. Every step felt like a fight for survival, but he didn't slow down because Era stayed beside him, moving with a strange mix of grace and determination that made her look stronger than her small frame suggested. She lifted her glowing hands again and again, sending bursts of psychic force that cracked walls and knocked enemies off their feet. But each time she used her power, her breathing grew weaker and her movements less steady. Aaron saw her hands trembling, saw the flickering light in her markings dimming, and he knew she couldn't keep this up much longer. They had to get to the engine chamber, the only place where he could try to restart the ship's systems and activate the shields before the VOR. Can destroyer outside blasted them into ashes. The closer they got, the stronger the rumbling became, until the whole floor vibrated like the ship was groaning in pain. Aaron burst through the engine chamber doors with Era close behind him, then raced across the room to a broken console. Wires hung from the wall like metal vines, and sparks snapped in the dark, but he didn't waste a second. He tore open a panel, dropped to one knee, and began pulling wires with shaking hands, praying the ship would give him even a little power. Era stepped in front of him, lifting her hands to form a shimmering shield around them as more Vulcan soldiers stormed the room. But the shield was weaker this time. Aaron saw cracks forming across the glowing surface like fractures spreading through glass. He yelled for Era to get back, but she didn't move, standing her ground even as the shield sputtered and dimmed. His heart pounded as he worked faster, his fingers burning on the exposed wires, sweat dripping into his eyes. He almost had it, just one more connection, when the massive Vulcan champion entered the chamber. The creature was twice the size of the others, its armor darker, its war axe burning with red light. It charged with a roar, slamming its axe into Era's shield and shattering it instantly. The force threw her across the floor, her small body hitting the metal with a painful thud. Aaron shouted her name and tried to run to her, but the champion swung again, and he barely rolled aside in time. Rage and fear twisted in his chest as he lunged for the nearest thing he could use as a weapon, a heavy power conduit cable still sparking with electricity. He grabbed it and swung with all his strength, slamming it into the champion's armor. Sparks exploded, and the giant stumbled backward, stunned for a moment. Era, lying weakly on the floor, lifted her head. Her markings flickered desperately, glowing faintly like dying stars. She reached out with one shaking hand and whispered Aaron's name, her voice faint but filled with determination. Then she unleashed one last burst of psychic force, a beam of blinding light that shot straight into the champion's chest. The giant didn't scream, didn't fight, it simply disintegrated into a cloud of ash and scattered metal. Era collapsed again as the light faded completely from her markings. At that exact moment, the wires in Aaron's hands sparked. The console hummed to life, and the engines roared awake as if the ship itself had taken a deep breath. Lights flickered on across the room, and the ancient cruiser came alive for the first time in years. Aaron rushed to Era's side, lifting her gently as the ship powered up around them, knowing the battle wasn't over yet but feeling a spark of hope rising through the smoke. The moment the engines roared awake, the derelict cruiser felt alive again, humming under Aaron's feet like a sleeping giant stirred from a long, cold dream. He carried Era to the bridge, her head resting weakly against his shoulder, her breathing soft and shallow, her markings almost dark. He set her gently beside the command chair and rushed to the controls, wiping dust from the old screens and praying the systems would hold together. Outside the windows, the blackness of space was broken by dozens of red lights flickering, fighters surrounding them like hungry wolves waiting for the kill. Aaron tightened his grip on the controls, anger and fear burning together inside him. He wasn't a pilot, not really, but he had trained enough to understand the basics, and right now even a beginner had to fight. As he guided the cruiser forward, the ship shook violently from the first barrage of enemy fire. Sparks flew from the ceiling, and smoke curled from the consoles, but Aaron gritted his teeth and kept going. The ship's old cannons responded slowly, then suddenly sprang to life, firing plasma bolts that tore through the nearest Vulcan fighters. For a moment he allowed himself to hope until he looked at Era. She lay curled on her side, her eyes half open but unfocused, her body shaking slightly as if every breath cost her strength she no longer had. He reached for her hand, feeling how cold her skin had become. "I need you," he whispered, not demanding, not pushing her, just speaking the truth. Her fingers curled weakly around his. A faint glow returned to her markings, not bright, but steady, like a small flame refusing to die. She lifted her other hand toward the controls, not touching them, but letting a soft wave of psychic energy flow outward. Suddenly the ship's systems brightened. The shields strengthened. The engines responded faster, and a quiet voice inside Aaron's head whispered warnings of incoming fire before the scanners picked it up. It wasn't words, just feelings, hints, directions like Era was guiding him with instincts instead of language. Together they moved as one. Aaron spun the cruiser into sharp turns, dodging enemy shots by seconds. He fired the cannons, and Era gave a small psychic push that made each blast hit harder, fly straighter, tear deeper. Vulcan fighters exploded around them like burning stars. But then the largest shadow appeared on the screen, the Vulcan dreadnought, a massive ship covered in spiked armor and glowing red engines, far bigger than anything they had fought so far. Its main cannon began to charge. Aaron's stomach twisted. One hit from that weapon would destroy them instantly. The cruiser shook again, harder than before, as the dreadnought fired smaller cannons that pounded their shields. The old ship groaned in protest. Warning lights flashed everywhere. Aaron pushed the engines forward, but they were cornered, outnumbered, and half the weapons were overheating. He glanced down at Era. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow, her markings flickering like fading embers. "I know you're tired," he said softly, voice cracking, "but I need one more push." "One more." Era opened her silver eyes, dull but filled with so much trust that Aaron felt his chest ache. She placed her trembling hand on his chest, right over his heart, and the air around her shimmered as her markings flared bright one last time. The ship surged forward with a burst of impossible speed, psychic energy boosting the engines far beyond their limit. Aaron fired every weapon at once, plasma cannons, railguns, everything the cruiser had left. At that same moment, Era sent a final wave of her power through the ship, guiding the blast straight into the dreadnought's core. Light swallowed the screen. The Vulcan flagship erupted in a massive explosion that shook space itself. The blast wave threw the cruiser off course and sent sparks flying across the bridge. When the light faded, the dreadnought was gone, nothing but drifting pieces of molten metal. Aaron slumped in his chair, breathing hard, staring at the screen in disbelief. They had survived. They had won. He turned to Era, whose hand was still resting over his heart. She smiled faintly, then closed her eyes and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep as the quiet of space settled around them once more. The rescue ships arrived many hours later, drawn by the emergency beacon that activated when the cruiser regained partial power, and their bright lights filled the darkness around the broken ship like a small sunrise. Inside the quiet bridge, Aaron sat slumped in the command chair, barely awake, his body aching from burns, bruises, and exhaustion. But none of that mattered to him, because Era lay curled up on his chest, sleeping peacefully as if the battle, the fear, and the darkness had never existed. Her small body rose and fell with each calm breath, and her silver eyes stayed shut, finally free from the panic that had lived in them from the moment he first saw her in that broken cage. Her glowing markings, once flickering like dying embers, now glowed gently with a soft, warm light, as if rest and safety had brought her back from the edge. Aaron kept one arm around her protectively, holding her without thinking, his hand resting between her shoulder blades in a quiet, steady rhythm. The door to the bridge slid open with a hiss, and rescue medics stepped inside, their helmets shining under the dim emergency lights. They froze at the sight before them, a human soldier half conscious but alive, and in his arms the alien girl everyone had whispered about for weeks, the girl they had feared, locked up, labeled dangerous. Commander Lewis was the first to find his voice. He stepped forward slowly, looking from Aaron to Era with disbelief written across his face. "Is she safe?" he asked cautiously, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile peace in the room. Aaron looked down at Era, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face with the side of his thumb. She didn't flinch. She didn't tense. She only snuggled closer, resting her head over his heart, trusting him completely. "She saved us all," Aaron said softly, his voice rough from smoke and exhaustion. "She's not feral. She was just alone." The medics exchanged glances, unsure how to respond, but they approached slowly, trying not to disturb her. When they tried to lift her off his chest, Era stirred, gripping Aaron's shirt with weak fingers as if afraid someone might take her away again. Aaron raised a hand to stop them. "Easy," he whispered. "Let her wake on her own." Era's eyes opened slowly, glowing softly as they adjusted to the brighter lights. She looked up at Aaron first, then at the strangers around them, her small body tensing at the sudden attention. Aaron squeezed her shoulder gently, calming her before fear could rise. She looked back at him, her silver eyes softening. For the first time, she spoke clearly, her voice quiet but warm. "Aaron." Just his name, simple, soft, but filled with trust. The medic stood frozen, stunned not only that she spoke, but that she spoke his name before anything else. As the rescue crew guided them toward the waiting shuttle, Era held on to Aaron's hand, refusing to let go even when the medics tried to examine her. She stayed pressed close to him, her head against his arm, as if the darkness of the past days still lingered behind her and he was the only light she trusted. When they finally boarded the rescue ship and lifted away from the derelict cruiser, Aaron looked out at the stars and felt something shift inside him. He had not only survived the impossible, he had formed a bond that crossed worlds, species, and fear. Era leaned her head against his shoulder, drifting back to sleep, safe at last. Humanity had gained more than a victory that day. It had gained an ally, a friend born not from power, but from kindness, trust, and the simple strength of two souls who refused to abandon each other. The war would continue, but something had changed forever, and Aaron knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together.